Acts chapter 20. We're actually moving forward. When the uproar had ended, that was the uproar in Ephesus that, through the whole, evidently, and from what Luke records, through the whole city into an uproar was a more or less nonviolent riot. When the uproar had ended, and you remember that Paul's friends, even one of his friends who was an official of the city, had sent word to him, don't come to the theater. Okay. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples and, after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. That's kind of like he was retracing a little bit of his route. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months. Paul, wherever he went, he seemed to be able to connect with people, and his purpose was virtually always to speak words of encouragement to the disciples, to the other believers, and to proclaim the good news, the gospel, wherever he went. When I was a young man, I was in high school, I guess, I remember a sermon. Well, no, I remember a portion of a sermon on Matthew 28:19, where Jesus said, "Go, therefore, into all the world and preach." Well, it may have even been my dad who this sermon was from. That's how poorly, I guess, I paid attention. But anyway, it could also, according to them, be translated "as you go." Well, Paul was the epitome of "as you go," wherever he went. And part of it was he had a unique and special calling. I won't even say he's the only one who had that calling, but I will say it is unique, his calling. It is not normal to be called to do the things and go to the places that Paul was called to. Wherever he went, it's like, it's just him. It's in him, and it's going to come out. Now, when he got to Greece, he stayed 3 months. I don't think he was just, kicked back and enjoying getting a suntan. Greece was a lovely place to be in the first century. I'm told it still is. But I can't help but think that when he arrived in Greece, in the 3 months that he was there, I think he was encouraging any believers and preaching the gospel. And one of the reasons I think this is because of what happens next. Because some Jews had plotted against him just as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. In other words, he was on his way out and he heard about a plot of Jews who wanted to, we're not sure. We're not told what the exact plot was, but I'm pretty sure they wanted to rub him out. Well, instead of going to Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. Verse 4. And now we get a window into another aspect of how Paul did what Paul did. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea. He'd been to Berea. Remember the Berean church? They studied Scripture, and they tested what Paul had preached and taught about against the Scripture, the Old Testament. Okay, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. That's a pretty good group of guys. That's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 traveling companions. I've done a little bit of traveling with people. I remember taking a group of guys, this is many years ago now, to Dallas for a Promise Keepers rally. There probably were, I don't know, 10 or 12 of us. And man, oh man, you talk about herding cats. You get that many adult men together, it's hard to stay on point. But evidently, they were able to. And I think possibly one of the reasons was these guys had such a high regard for Paul. And he was the captain of the team. And what he said, they would do. Verse 5, these men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. Now we're into another us section, or we section. So I think what I get from this is that Luke had omitted himself from this list because he, either that or he had been hanging out in Macedonia and then connected with Paul and these guys, but these men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. But we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Luke includes a ton of details. He did this in in his gospel, in the book of Luke. He gives historic and timeline pegs to verify the truth of his account. This seems like down in the weeds a little bit, right? But it's I think Luke's way of providing authenticity and security to the reader that this is not just a made-up story. This is what happened and how. Well, after the festival of unleavened bread, they sailed from Philippi. The festival of unleavened bread that's around Passover. During the Passover, you couldn't have yeast or leaven in your house. You couldn't, because it wasn't in your house, you couldn't cook with it, you couldn't use it. And we I think forget that in the first centuries, among Jews in particular, bread was the staff of life. It was the primary ingredient at every meal. Yes, there were times where there was meat served, but bread was the deal, and not Wonder Bread, flat bread, unleavened bread, bread without yeast. It didn't rise. All of that. I think the implication I get is that Paul honored the tradition of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And after that, they headed out. 5 days of journey brought them to Troas. 5 days from Philippi to Troas. And they stayed there 7 days. More details. While they were there, in verse 7, it picks up. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. A couple of things. The first day of the week is Sunday. Jewish custom was that the Sabbath, Saturday, was the day to gather. The Christian tradition is to gather on Sunday. I believe one of the reasons for this is that Jesus rose from the grave on Saturday. And it seemed that established the tradition. It wasn't I don't think it was a hill to die on. Do you go to church on Sunday, or do you go to Saturday, or I don't think that's the point. But on the first day of the week, there's Luke including himself again, came together to break bread. Now there's two at least possible meanings for the term breaking bread. One is that was also a term for we ate together. I mean, even occasionally we'll hear or say, let's get together and break bread. Okay. Yeah. But there's this other aspect that connects breaking bread with what we call communion. Jesus had established this with his disciples on the Thursday night before he was that night he was betrayed, and then Friday, we call it Good Friday, but there was, in the moment, nothing good about it. But Jesus had established it. Remember, the bread is his flesh. The wine is his blood. I don't know which. I have a sense that it was both. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. Man, you think I'm long-winded? They didn't start their meal at like 10:30 or 11 that night. Once the sun went down, most work ended, and that's when they would have gathered. He spoke on until midnight, and this is because he intended to leave the next day. Verse 8. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. First thing, upstairs room. Second, when there are many lamps, there's a lot of smoke. Okay. Verse 9. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. Been there, done that, although not in the windowsill. God, I'm not critical of Eutychus at all when I think about it, okay? A smoky room, the smoke from these oil lamps, end of a day, and late at midnight, Paul was going on and on. That is to me an interesting choice of words. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. Now that'll end a meeting. That'll put a spin on what happened when the church gathered. We'll talk more about it next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.